Well, it's good to be with you again today, and we'll be continuing talking about some of the holidays that we see during Holy Week. During Holy Week on our calendars, we see a number of days that are mentioned, and we talked about the Resurrection Day. We've also talked about Palm Sunday, and today we'll be talking about Passover. Passover is usually at least mentioned the beginning of what's considered to be the Passover week. On most calendars, we see that it's at least mentioned, alluded to in some way, but some calendars do not list it at all during the Holy Week. But Passover has a lot of significance to us as Christians, and that's something that we want to talk about a little bit today. I'm going to split this teaching into two parts. Today's teaching, we're going to talk about the origin of Passover and look at how it was observed in the Old Testament times. And in our next teaching, we'll look at the development of traditions and see how it was observed in the New Testament times. So we'll be looking at that in two parts. So today we're going to get into the beginning teaching of this, part one, if you will, really focusing on the Old Testament aspects of Passover. Now, to set the stage, and we're not going to go through the whole story, but most people probably are familiar with the history of Israel and some specific events that have happened over time that caused their situation to greatly change. And I'm speaking specifically of the fact that there's a point in time where a famine comes, and if you remember the story, Joseph in the book of Genesis had been sold into slavery by his brothers, and Joseph rises to prominence in Egypt and actually is second only to Pharaoh, and he ends up being the one who interprets Pharaoh's dreams about the famines that are coming and the fact that there's a way that Egypt should prepare for this, and if they do that, then they will be okay during the famine time. Well, one of the things that we see play out in the Bible is the fact that Joseph ends up bringing his family into Egypt, and thereby they are saved while they're in Egypt there during the time of the famine. And it's a very interesting story that we see the one that was sold into slavery ends up being the one that saves all of Israel. So Joseph is a very important figure in the Bible. I do want to show you a passage. Let's go to Genesis 46. Genesis 46 in the Scripture. I want to show you, just by way of some background here, I want to show you there's something that I think is very important in the Bible, that the Bible mentions, that we want to take note of here before we go further. In Genesis 46, we see that Joseph is going back to bring his father Jacob into Egypt. And I'm going to start in verse 29. It says, "So Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. And he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, 'Now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive.' Then Joseph said to his brothers and his father's household, 'I will go up and tell Pharaoh and say to him, my brothers and those of my father's house who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for their occupation has been to feed livestock. And they have brought their flocks, their herds, and all that they have. So it shall be, when Pharaoh calls you and says, "What is your occupation?" that you shall say, "Your servant's occupation has been with livestock from our youth even till now, both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen." Now here's the phrase that we want to take note of here. It says, "For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians." Now that's an interesting phrase that's given there, and as we know, when the Israelites came into Egypt, they were kept in a separate part of Egypt, what was considered to be the best part of Egypt, Goshen, and Joseph gives some directions to his father, his family, about the time when they're presented in front of Pharaoh, that they are to be very specific, and this is honest as well, but they're to be very specific about the fact that they are shepherds. And Joseph even mentions in this verse, in verse 34, he says, "For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians." Now that's a verse that, so we learn something about the Egyptians there, their perception of people who work with animals, and of course a shepherd, generally speaking, is one who deals with sheep. When we think of a shepherd, that's what we think of, a person who guards and takes care of sheep. So we learn a little bit about not only the Israelites, that they're primarily agricultural in the sense that they grow crops and they raise animals for their survival. And in the Egyptian land where they are now, the Egyptians sometimes have very different views, very different beliefs about some of these things. So Joseph has been there for some time. He's aware of these things, so he is preparing his family for this time. Now let me show you that in the next chapter, in Genesis 47, his family does exactly what he has asked them to do. It says in verse 1, "Then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, My father and my brothers, their flocks and their herds and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan, and indeed they are in the land of Goshen. And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, What is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, Your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers." So if we continue into verse 4, we see, "And they said to Pharaoh, We have come to dwell in the land, because your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." And of course, we know that Pharaoh does allow that because of the goodness of Joseph and all that Joseph has been able to accomplish through the blessing of God. And here we see that Israel does come into the land. This matter of them being shepherds and dealing with animals is brought up. And the fact that it's very interesting that Egypt accepts them, allows them to come into the land because of what Joseph has done. And yet they're somewhat separated at this time from the others and are allowed to live in the way that they're accustomed to living. So that's an important little piece of information there that we'll come back to in just a little bit as we think about Passover. Now, when we get to the end of the book of Genesis, we find out that Jacob does pass away and is buried. Another thing that we see happening at the end of Genesis in chapter 50 is that Joseph also dies. And the Bible says in Genesis 50:26 that Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you know that what we're going to see happening is that God's people will be leaving Egypt. Now, things change over time in Egypt. in the book of Genesis, when Israel comes into the land, they come in the land in favor because they are the family of Joseph, who is risen to such prominence in Egypt. But over time, there's a series of rulers in Egypt who do not know Joseph and do not know how Israel has been a blessing to Egypt and sustained Egypt. So the way that Israel is treated in the land changes over time, and we're going to look at just a couple of things that kind of set the stage for something that God is doing here. And you notice in Exodus chapter 1, when we get into chapter 1, it mentions in the first few verses there the names of the children of Israel who came in and what we would consider to be the 12 tribes. And verse 7 says, "But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." Now verse 8 sets the background for a great change that takes place. Verse 8 in chapter 1 of Exodus, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel." So it's very interesting here. The Bible says that one of the main motivations that the Egyptians had in enslaving the Israelites was there was a fear of the number of them, a fear of the possibility of them rebelling against Egypt or joining with another nation to rise up against Egypt. Verse 13 says, "So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor." Now, there's another factor that comes into play here. Not only was Israel enslaved, but because there was a fear of the number of children that were being born to the Israelites, there arose a plan to kill all of the Hebrew males that were born. Now we see this in chapter 1 of Exodus, and verse 15. It says, "Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive." Now this is very interesting because a command has come down from the king of Egypt that every male child that's born should be killed. And he gave this responsibility to the midwives, the ones that would be helping the Hebrew women birth their children. And perhaps there was an attempt here by killing all the males that the females would end up marrying Egyptians and they would assimilate them into their own people. I'm not sure about that. Maybe that's a possibility there that the king had in mind. But the midwives, when they were faced with this task, this command from the king to do this, they did not do it. The Bible says, in verse 17, it says they feared God. And instead, they saved these little Hebrew boys that were born. Now, you cannot do this, ignore the command of a king without generating some attention And at some point, they began to inquire of these midwives what was happening with all of the children. Verse 18 of Exodus 1 says, So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. So the story that the midwives give is that they've already delivered the children before we even get there. And notice that God sees what is happening, and the fact that these midwives are not willing to obey this evil command from an evil king, and God blesses them. Verse 20 says, Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that He provided households for them. And we see the hardness of Pharaoh's heart here, this desire to kill these Hebrew males that are born, to stop the growth of the people of God, and possibly to assimilate them into Egyptian society here. Verse 22, So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So Pharaoh, in his anger with the midwives who were not doing this, gave another command that every time a son was born, they were to be cast into the river, obviously to drown and to end the life of these children. Now, when we get into chapter 2, we see a very familiar story of Moses, who is born, and it's very interesting. We'll just read a few verses of this story, but of course we know Moses will be the great deliverer for Israel. He will be the one God will use to bring them out of Egypt. Chapter 2 of Exodus says this, verse 1, And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. Now that's definitely against the command there of the king of Egypt. Verse 3, But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. So she basically took Moses and put him in a little floating basket. Verse 4 says, And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Verse 5 says, Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it, and when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. Now this is an amazing chain of events here, because Moses' own mother ends up nursing Moses, and he will eventually go and live in the house of Pharaoh with Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 10 says, And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, Because I drew him out of the water. Now that's interesting that in hiding Moses, his own mother put him in a protective basket, and yet he was her son and was cast into the river, though not with the intent that the evil Egyptian king had. So Moses was cast in the water, safe in the ark, and now taken out by Pharaoh's daughter and Moses will grow up within the household of Pharaoh. Now, an event happens that I'll just mention real quickly because in the Bible, time to get through the teaching, but I'm hoping that most people are fairly familiar with a lot of these events that we're referring to here, and that you'll be able to kind of piece these things together. But one thing happens as Moses grows up, he begins to have a lot of compassion for the Hebrew people. And we see an event that happens still in chapter 2 of Exodus where an Egyptian is beating a Hebrew, and Moses stands up for the Hebrew and actually slays the Egyptian and hides him in the sand. And as a result of that, Moses ends up leaving Egypt. And while Moses is away from Egypt, God calls Moses to go back. Moses will actually be the one that will be the deliverer for Israel, and God calls him back in chapter 3 of Exodus. We see the burning bush there that's very prominent in this story. God's revealing of himself to Moses, God's calling of him back to Egypt. Very, very powerful parts of the story there. I'll let you read through those on your own, but they're all very powerful, have much to add to the story. Now, as we get into chapter 4, we find out that Moses has a concern that the people will not listen to him, and that they will not, particularly, they're not going to think that Moses has come under the command of God. They're going to question that. They're not going to believe that. So God gives a couple of signs to Moses that he can use to show the people that he is from the Lord. And of course, Moses makes an excuse that he's not able to speak well, and God calls Aaron to be the spokesman, Aaron, who is Moses' brother. Now, in this, now you have Moses, who God is called to do this, and also you have Aaron, who will be the spokesman. And they have to go back to Egypt. They have to go to Egypt, and they will, during this time, they will reach out to the Israelite people with the message that God is about to rescue them. God is about to take them out of the land of Egypt. And just as Moses was concerned with, there was some doubt within the people of Israel. Of course, they've been in slavery now for hundreds of years. So it's obvious to understand why they would have been very doubtful about this, or didn't want to get their hopes up again after being in slavery for so long. But I want to show you something that the Lord says that I think is very important in thinking about what we've read so far. If you look in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 21, let's just start in 18 there. It says, "So Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, 'Please let me go and return to my brethren who are in Egypt, and see whether they are still alive.' And Jethro said to Moses, 'Go in peace.'" Now, Jethro, of course, his father-in-law. Verse 19, "Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, 'Go, return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead.' Then Moses took his wife and his sons and set them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand." Now, the rod that Moses had was one that God used to show him a sign. When Moses threw the rod down, it became a serpent. When he picked the serpent up by the tail, it would become a rod again. And this was one of the signs Moses would use to show the people of Israel that God had not forgotten them and was about to do great things. Verse 21 says, "And the Lord said to Moses, 'When you go back to Egypt, see that you do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in your hand. but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, Thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Now this is a very interesting statement that God is making here about Israel. And he's talking about Israel as a group, as a nation of people here. Notice what he says, verse 23, So I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. Now, it's God's desire for Israel to be released from bondage, to be out of Egypt, so that they as a people, they as the children of God, can serve the Lord. And this is exactly what God commands Moses to tell Pharaoh. But notice the second half of verse 23. But if you refuse to let go, indeed, I will kill your son, your firstborn. Now think of this. In reading through this many times, I have to admit I may have missed the fact that at the very beginning of these warnings that will go to Pharaoh, there's already a warning at the very beginning that if Pharaoh does not comply with God, that God will kill the firstborn of Egypt. And I just want to show you that before we get into this a little bit deeper about how this plays into the Passover and how this plays into the release of Israel from Egypt. So we notice right here at the beginning that God gives this warning to Pharaoh about what is about to happen. And we see in the plagues, the number of plagues that come on them, that each time Pharaoh is not complicit. He comes close a few times, but his hard-heartedness will just not let him allow Israel to leave. Now we see a suggestion here in verse 24. It says, And it came to pass on the way at the encampment. Let me move on past that. Let me read it. And it came to pass on the way at the encampment that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at Moses' feet and said, Surely you are a husband of blood to me. So he let him go. Then she said, You are a husband of blood because of the circumcision. Now, this is about the fact that Moses, in all of this, had not even circumcised his son properly here. And it's sad that Moses had not obeyed the sign that had been given to Abraham of circumcision. This was a covenant that God made with Israel, and Moses had not done this. And here he was about to be the representative in Egypt, and God is angry with him because of that. But yet Moses is spared in this instance, and we see that Moses will go on and he will be the deliverer here. Now, moving on into chapter 5, it says, Afterward Moses, I'm in verse 1, Afterward Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. And we see Pharaoh comes back and says, Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go. So they said, The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the desert and sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. Then the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people from their work? Get back to your labor. And Pharaoh said, Look, the people of the land are many now, and you make them rest from their labor. So the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, You shall no longer give the people straw to make brick as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. and you shall lay on them the quota of bricks which they made before. You shall not reduce it, for they are idle. Therefore they cry out, saying, Let us go and sacrifice to our God. Let more work be laid on the men, that they may labor in it, and let them not regard false words. And the taskmasters of the people and their officers went out and spoke to the people, saying, Thus says Pharaoh, I will not give you straw. Go get yourself straw where you can find it, yet none of your work will be reduced. So the people were scattered abroad throughout all the land of Egypt to gather stubble instead of straw. So we find out that because of this, there is quite a problem here. There's a punishment that comes on the people of Israel because of this news that Moses brings to Pharaoh. And quite honestly, the people are not happy with Moses at this point. Now, one thing that we see is that Pharaoh suggests to the people of Israel, or particularly Moses and Aaron, that they worship God in the land of Egypt. Now, let me show you this. This is in Exodus chapter 8. It said this, and this is after the swarms of flies that come on to Egypt. But in verse 25 of chapter 8 it says, Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, Go, sacrifice to your God. But notice he says, in the land. If you remember, Moses' request was that they would be allowed to go 3 days into the desert and worship God in their way. And Pharaoh here, after dealing with some of these plagues, he is suggesting to Moses that they sacrifice right where they are. Do their worship, but do it right where they are and not leave. Now notice verse 26. And Moses said, It is not right to do so, for we would be sacrificing the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. If we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes, then will they not stone us? Now you remember earlier when we began this study, we saw in the book of Genesis where Joseph told to his family that were coming into Egypt that shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians, and that they were to say specifically when they appeared before Pharaoh that they were shepherds and that they kept livestock and sheep. Now here in this, when Pharaoh, in a way to try to get the people satisfied and maybe make these plagues stop, he gives them the suggestion of sacrificing in the land. But notice that Moses said in verse 26 that they would be sacrificing the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. And Moses says if they do that, if they sacrifice something that is an abomination, or they do something that is extremely offensive to the Egyptians, then the Egyptians will kill them. And that's letting us know that there's something that God is going to require Israel to do that would be very, very different from what you saw in Egyptian practice, and something that would be very, very offensive to the Egyptians. If we read on, verse 27, it says, We will go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God as He will command us. And of course, Pharaoh, as he often does, he agrees to allow this to happen, but then he'll stop it. Verse 28 says, So Pharaoh said, I will let you go, that you may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness. Only you shall not go very far away. Intercede for me. And of course Moses replies, verse 29, Then Moses said, Indeed, I am going out from you, and I will entreat the Lord that the swarms of flies may depart tomorrow from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people. But let Pharaoh not deal deceitfully any more, and not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. So that's a very interesting thing. Again, we have this idea of abomination. We know that shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. We also know without a doubt that something that they're about to do in their worship is going to be very offensive to the Egyptians, and Moses is very straightforward about this and tells Pharaoh that if they carry out this worship in the land of Israel, that it's likely that they will be killed because of the nature of this. So these are very interesting details. If we're not looking for these carefully, it'd be easy to miss these. And I had to admit, in the past, in reading through, I maybe didn't always pick up on some of these things that are mentioned in the text here. And we'll have more to say about it in just a minute. Now, there's a great promise that I want to show you in the book of Exodus here before we move on. And this is the great promise that God makes to Israel. And we want to look at this because this is going to have a lot to do with our development of the Passover celebration later, and we'll get deeper into this. But I want you to see that there are 4 great promises that God makes to Israel during this time. Now, this, of course, is before they've been rescued from Egypt and before they've left the land. But I want you to see there are 4 things that God is promising them, and this is in Exodus 6. I'll begin reading in verse 1. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will let them go, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land. And God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, Lord, I was not known to them." Now that name in our Bible in capitals there, we would know it as Jehovah is the way most people say it, or Yehovah. Some people call that name Yahweh, but the writing of the capitals, L-O-R-D, is a substitution word that's used for the name of God in the text by tradition. But he says, "But by my name, Lord, I was not known to them. I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, in which they were strangers. And I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord." Now notice there are four main things that are mentioned here that God will do on behalf of the children of Israel. First thing, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. This is a great promise that their servitude of Egypt will come to an end. This is God's promise to them. Notice also, I will rescue you from their bondage. In other words, there will be a removal. There'll be a removal of God's people from this place of servitude. They will be independent. And that's, you think of a rescuer coming in and taking someone out of a deadly situation or a dangerous situation. God says He will rescue you from their bondage. Third thing He mentions, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. That word redeem means to pay the ransom or to buy back or to pay the debt that someone else owes. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's the idea of the kinsman redeemer, a family member that came in and saved the day, so to speak, for their family member that could not take care of their own issues. This was the idea of the kinsman redeemer. So God says that He will rescue them and He will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. In other words, God is going to receive them with His arm outstretched to them, but there will be great judgments against the ones who have treated them unfairly, taken advantage of them, mistreated them. And then we see the fourth thing, I will take you as my people and I will be your God. Now they will be entering into a relationship with God where God receives them. This is a covenant situation where they're entering into a relationship with God here, and God takes them as His people, and their responsibility in this is to take God as their God, their only God. And you may be thinking as you hear this, that kind of sounds like a marriage relationship where you make agreements, vows to each other. Yes, it's very much like that, and this is very much the relationship aspect that Israel has with God. And we see that in them coming out of Egypt, these promises are given to them. God is going to do this great thing, and they're going to come to Him. They're going to come out of Egypt, and they're going to come to Him. Reading on in verse 7, it says, "Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as a heritage. I am the Lord." So this is the great promise that God gives to Israel. You know, honestly, in reading through the Scriptures, we see where they didn't always understand this, and many times they were disheartened because of everything that was going on. And honestly, probably a lot of times they didn't have a lot of faith as they were going through these things, and especially with their workload being increased over and over. But yet, these promises are very important to look at because they have a lot to do with Passover, as we're going to see. Now, moving on to the timing of this. Now, the timing of this is very important, and I want to show you in Exodus chapter 9, it mentions a few details here that we want to take note of as we're looking at this story and getting some background. We go into Exodus chapter 9, and verse 31 says, "Now the flax and the barley were struck, for the barley was in the head, and the flax was in bud." So that's telling you the time of year that it was. This means that it would be springtime, right around the time of spring. Barley would come in as a crop in the springtime, and flax also would come in during that time, we can tell from the verse. But notice verse 32, "But the wheat and the spelt were not struck, for they are late crops." Now, in Israel, in the land of Canaan, it's this way also, as it is described here in Egypt. But the first thing that comes out is barley. That's the first harvest that takes place in the Bible, the barley harvest, and it's during the springtime. Then later, the wheat comes. It's considered a summer harvest that takes place, and then later in the year they have grapes and fruits and things that are harvested later. But the Bible is telling us that this time that all of this is going on with Moses and Aaron and their attempt to try to get Pharaoh to let them go, what we see is the Bible is giving us a detail about the timing of this and when this is happening. Now, if we look in chapter 10, you go in chapter 10, it's mentioned here that, again, Moses tells Pharaoh that they are to go out and have this time of worship. Chapter 10, verse 9 says, "And Moses said, We will go with our young and with our old, with our sons and our daughters, with our flocks and our herds, we will go, for we must hold a feast to the Lord." It's very interesting in the Bible. There's a word that's used, feast. The Hebrew word is moedim. It means appointed times, God's appointed times in the Scripture. So we see that this thing about Israel being able to go and have a time to worship the Lord through this feast is very important. It's God's appointed time. Moses is taking the word of God to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, knowing that from the beginning the possibility is there that God will strike the firstborn, continues to forbid the people to leave, and even suggest that they worship God right there in the land. Now, another thing that we see is God reaches a point where He's ready to carry out what He said in the beginning of this. And as you're reading through the Bible, what you find out is there are things that are done in response to things that happen. For example, we saw in the Bible where the king of Egypt said all the Hebrew males should be killed. At first, the midwives were supposed to do it, and then they were supposed to be taken and thrown into the water to drown. And then you see God, in His judgment against Israel, ultimately what He will do is He will kill the firstborn of Egypt. But all of the plagues happen and increase in intensity over time. At any time during that, Pharaoh could have relented and let them go without the loss of the firstborn. But we find out that through the hardness of heart that Pharaoh has, God eventually reaches a point here where it is time for punishment on Egypt for what they have done and the household of Pharaoh. Now in Exodus 11 it says this, verse 1, "And the Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. Afterward He will let you go from here. When He lets you go, He will surely drive you out of here altogether. Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor and every woman from her neighbor articles of silver and articles of gold." And the Lord gave the people favor in sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. Then Moses said, "Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt." Now this is very interesting here in verse 4. Many times we think about this being the death angel or the destroyer, and those are terms also used in the Bible. But notice verse 4 says, "About midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt. And all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the animals. Then there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not like it before, nor shall be like it again. But against none of the children of Israel shall a dog move its tongue, against man or beast, that you may know that the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, Get out, and all the people who follow you. After that I will go out." Then he went out from Pharaoh in great anger. But the Lord said to Moses, "Pharaoh will not heed you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt." In other words, God is letting Moses know that He is about to execute judgment on the house of Pharaoh. Verse 10 says, "So Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel go out of his land." All right, so we have been looking at some background. I know this has taken a little bit of time here to get into some of the background of what is building up to get to this, but now we see the process by which God will execute judgment on Egypt and yet at the same time protect Israel. And the way God does that is through the Passover. The Passover. So now we get into God's plan to protect Israel through the Passover. We're in Exodus chapter 12. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you." This is very interesting. Most of our calendars start in the winter time, and here in the Bible, the calendar that the Hebrews would operate from starts in the springtime. This event, their release from Egypt, would be the beginning of their year for them. Verse 3 says, "Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats." Now this is interesting. We always think of this as a sheep but God also allowed that if they did not have a sheep, they were allowed to use a goat here. And goats were part of the sacrificial system that took place later under the law of Moses. Now, in giving these instructions, one of the things that we see is that this is a lamb that has to be taken and inspected. There's not to be any sickness, no blemish, no deformities. It's to be a perfect specimen of a lamb. So they're to choose that lamb on the 10th day. And they are to watch it and inspect it for 4 days. Verse 6 says, "Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight." So what they were supposed to do was to take their lamb. They would have it from the 10th day until the 14th day. They would inspect it carefully to make sure there was no sickness, blemish, deformity in any way. And then as the evening of the 14th would come around, all of the people at the same time, they would take their lamb and they would take its life. Now, one thing that we should say here, in the Bible, a day is reckoned from the time that the sun goes down until the time that the sun goes down the next day. That's a day in Hebrew thinking in the Bible. For us, we say that midnight begins a new day. But for the Hebrews, when the sun went down at the end of the day, that was the end of a day and the beginning of a new day. So when the sun would go down on the 14th day of this first month, they would collectively, as a group, they would take these lambs and they would take the life of the lamb. It would be at twilight. In other words, between the evenings. The evening of the 14th is approaching, and the end of that day, and as it got dark, it would become the 15th, the beginning of a new day. That's what's considered twilight here. Verse 7, "And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it." Now this is interesting. As they kill this animal, they're to collect the blood, and they are to take some of the blood and put it on the door frame of their houses, on the 2 sides of the house, and also on the top beam of the house. You can almost imagine in somebody doing that and taking that blood and putting some on one side and then going over to put some on the other side and then above, that you're almost making the sign of a cross there by doing that motion and putting the blood there. Notice also that they're to eat this animal that was sacrificed. The blood is the main thing that they are doing and applying to the household, but the animal itself, they will be cooking it and they will be enjoying a fellowship together in this meal. But notice, one thing that's unusual, they're to eat bread that is unleavened. In other words, it will not have yeast added to it in order to make it rise, to make it fluffy and full. It will be flat bread, or matzo as the Jewish people call it. And notice also they're to eat bitter herbs during this time. Verse 9 says, "Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roast it in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire." So they're to eat this animal as completely as possible, but not save any of it. They're to burn whatever remains in the fire. Verse 11, "And thus you shall eat it with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." Now, the idea of this meal is that they make the sacrifice, they apply the blood, then they eat the meal, but God tells them to be in a state of readiness to leave from Egypt. Now notice, here's some explanation. And of course these instructions, God is speaking to Moses and Aaron and telling them what to tell the people, what they should do. Here's the reason why for all of this. Verse 12, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night." Notice again, the Lord says, I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now notice here, God is saying that without a doubt, He will be going through the land tonight. He will be executing the firstborn in the land of Egypt, of man and beast, and that He will be executing judgment against the gods of Egypt. And Egypt, as a group of people, had many, many gods, many various beliefs about gods, and in fact they often believed that the Pharaoh himself was a god. And so their beliefs are very different than the Hebrew people. And God, He will execute judgment against the gods of Egypt. Verse 13 says, "Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." So this is a very interesting picture. The people in the house are protected by the blood of the Lamb on the doorpost of the house. What God is looking for as He passes through is to see the application of the blood of the Lamb on the doorpost of the house. When He sees that, He will pass over that home. The implication, of course, is that if He does not see the blood of the Lamb on the door, then the firstborn in that house of man and beast will be executed by the Lord. Now, of course, the emphasis on this is the application of the blood. The application of the blood. Now, this event is so important that even at the beginning of this, God tells them that when this event happens, they are to have a memorial of this. Verse 14 says, "So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance." So this is very important to God, because He mentions that not only will they be rescued in this instance, but also that they are to remember this time every year. They're to have a memorial of this event that happened. And this is what the Lord is indicating to them. We see in verse 15, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. So this is very serious, not just in the time when this actually happens when they're in Egypt, but as they're leaving Egypt, they will be in haste and they are to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. It says, verse 16, "On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you." So there is an allowance on the 1st and the 7th day of this memorial that food can be prepared, but it's not a regular work day. They're not to go to their regular work and treat it just like any other day. Verse 17 says, "So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening." So even before the event has happened where God comes through Egypt, He's already instructed them that they're to have a memorial of this event. This event will be so great that frees them from Egypt that they are to have a memorial of this every year. We know that the Passover is something that is celebrated that first day at twilight, the end of the 14th in the evening time, the beginning of the 15th is when the Passover is remembered, and then also the 7 days of eating unleavened bread called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. These two things together make up 8 days of this feast. So we see the Lord already is giving instructions about a memorial. Verse 19 says, "For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread." So already there's instruction there about the memorial that's to take place, that Israel will remember this. Now comes the time when Moses is to give the direction that God has given to the people. And we see this pick up in Exodus 12 and verse 21. "Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, Pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop," that was like a little scrub brush that grew over there, "dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning." So here Moses is giving some definition of what God has said about taking the blood of the lamb and applying it. Moses is telling them in detail how to do that. And once they've applied this blood on the doorpost of their house, they're to go into the house and not come out again until the morning. The reason why is this, verse 23, "For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever." I don't know if you can imagine in your mind's eye what it must have been like at that time to go through this and to take the lamb and to apply the blood to the doorpost of your house, and then to take all of your family inside and wait, just to wait and see what is going to happen. It must have been a very challenging time, stressful time for Israel as they were sheltered in place, if you will, during this time when God is carrying out His judgment on the land of Egypt. Now we see also where Moses directs them about what they're to do with the lamb, but also we see that he directs them about the keeping of the memorial. That is in verse 24, "And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as He promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall be when your children say to you, What do you mean by this service? That you shall say, It is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when He struck the Egyptians and delivered our households." So the people, after hearing all of this and thinking about what has been said and what they need to do, their response in verse 27 is, "So the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the children of Israel went away and did so just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did." So we see there God has instructed Moses and Aaron on the sacrifice and also the memorial of this event that will happen. Then we see where Moses delivers this information to the people about the sacrifice and also the memorial of the sacrifice. And now comes the time when we see that God carries out the thing that He said He would do. We see this in chapter 12 of Exodus in verse 29. It says, "And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead." So God kept His promise, the thing that He had warned at the very beginning with Pharaoh. And Pharaoh went through all of those plagues, never relenting, never allowing God's people to leave. And now God has fulfilled His word in killing the firstborn. I can imagine that it must have been a horrible time to hear all of the screams of people at that time. And yet, for the people of Israel, they were protected by the blood of the Lamb. So God, just as He said, has carried out His sentence here on Egypt. Now, I want to mention a point here that's very interesting to me. I didn't always know this, but if you remember, we made a point of saying that before Israel came into the land, or as they came into the land, Joseph advised his father, his brothers, about appearing before Pharaoh, and he said to them, he said, when you appear before them and they ask you what you do, you tell them that you're shepherds, and that shepherds are an abomination to Egypt. So we know that there were some things that they did that were offensive to the Egyptians. Now, an interesting point about this is later when Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, we want to go 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice to our God. Pharaoh suggests to them that they do it right here in the land. And Moses says no, because the thing that they will do will be an abomination to the Egyptians, and that when the Egyptians realize what they are doing, the Egyptians will want to kill them. So in that instance, they are not allowed to go into the wilderness. Now, an interesting thing that I found out, I was not aware of this, I did not know this until I did a little digging and reading about this. But one of the reasons that this is mentioned briefly in the Bible, and we see where God says that He will execute judgment against the gods of Egypt, is because of the fact that in Egypt the lamb was a sacred representation of two of their gods. There were two of their gods that were particularly associated with a lamb. One of them is named Amun, A-M-U-N. I'm reading an article here from the Torah.com. It's called Sacrificing a Lamb in Egypt. And it says this: this passage suggests that Moses recognizes that the Israelites are going to sacrifice an animal that is sacred to the Egyptians, and that this would be an abomination for the Egyptians. Ostensibly, this is because the ram was the sacred animal of two Egyptian gods, Amun and Khnum. It says this about Amun. Amun was a very important god in ancient Egypt and in the New Kingdom. He was seen as the king of the gods and was syncretized with the sun god as Amun-Ra. It would doubtless have been offensive to the priest of Amun to sacrifice a ram, and there certainly were temples of Amun in the delta in the vicinity of Goshen and the capital, Pi-Rameses. That such an act would be offensive would have been clear to any educated person who knew about Egypt in ancient times. Herodotus, in his survey of Egyptian customs, writes, "Now all who have a temple set up to the Theban Zeus or Amun, or who are of the district of Thebes, these, I say, all sacrifice goats and abstain from sheep. The Egyptians make the image of Zeus or Amun into the face of a ram. The Thebans then do not sacrifice rams, but hold them sacred for this reason." Centuries later, the Roman historian Publius Cornelius Tacitus, who believes that Moses created the Torah laws to polemicize against Egyptians, even suggests that the Jews sacrificed rams for the sake of despising Amun. And it also says, as far as this, the summation of this, and of course there was a second god that's mentioned, Khnum. I won't read this whole article, but it says this in summation. It says, the worship of sacred animals is as old as Egyptian religion. Each of the major and many of the minor deities had their specific sacred animals. Although veneration of these animals was part and parcel of the cult from olden times, it assumed a new significance under foreign, for example, Persian domination, when the cult of the sacred animals became a matter of cultural religious identity, not unlike cow worship in India under British colonial rule. The mention of the word abomination, a taboo in the sense of the most sacred, untouchable item of the Egyptians, seems to reflect this stage in the Persian era when the sacred animals achieved the highest status of sanctity in Egypt. In turn, this taboo would have been well known in the Persian age, both to Greek writers like Herodotus and to the Jewish scribes in Jerusalem, who gave us the final form of the Exodus story. Now, what you can take from that article there were two gods in Egypt that were considered to be the most powerful and representative gods. And when God says that He is executing judgment on the gods of Egypt, it's very interesting that He has His people sacrifice a lamb, which would have been sacred to the Egyptians. And not only did they sacrifice it and take the blood and put it on the doors, but they actually roast and eat the lamb, which would have just been abhorrent to the Egyptians. So there's some imagery there. If you think about this, there's a very strong message that's being sent, and I think this is one of the reasons why not only the killing of the firstborn, but also in the way that this happens, there's a message that the gods of Egypt do not protect them from the judgment of the God of Israel. And the God of Israel has His people kill a lamb representative of the Egyptian gods, and the blood is taken and brings salvation on the household. And the people eat the sacred imagery of the Egyptians. That's a very interesting thought. I've never gotten into that very much. It'll be something I want to research further, but I mention it to you in passing. So the Israelites, this would have not been that different for them. They were used to doing sacrifices of different animals. We read about that throughout the Bible, although it had not been formalized yet in the law of Moses. But here, and then doing this thing that they may have been accustomed to doing for some time, the representation of this to the Egyptians, it would not have been good. And this is one of the reasons why they want the people of God to be expelled from the land. This is adding insult to injury. It's very intentional. It is, it's a very serious thing that God has done. He is gaining victory over the Egyptians in every possible way. Now, getting back into the text here for just a minute, we saw where God moves through the land. He takes the firstborn of man and beast. Now we're going to see where the people depart from Egypt very quickly. This is in Exodus 12, verse 31. It says, Then He called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We shall all be dead. They were terrified at what might happen if they did not get the Israelites out of the land as quickly as possible. You remember we saw one of God's promises was that He would rescue them from the threat of the Egyptians. Verse 34 says that the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So the Israelites would not leave Egypt empty-handed. Although pretty much everything had been taken from the people of Israel over the years by the Egyptians, now when the Israelites are expelled from Egypt, they do not leave empty-handed. God has made sure that the riches of Egypt will leave with the people of Israel. Now, we read on just a few verses, and this shows you the exit. Verse 37 says, Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them also flocks and herds, a great deal of livestock. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves. Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. They had been there for a very, very long time. 41, and it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So this is what's called the Exodus. When you read this book in the Bible, the Exodus, that means the exit, the removal, the journey of God's people out of Egypt. Now, also included here in this chapter, we've already seen instructions about the lamb. We've seen instructions about the memorial. We saw the delivery of that information to the people. We saw that they carried out that. But we see again that this is so important that the people understand this thing that God has done. This is not a light thing. It is a thing to be remembered. Verse 42 in chapter 12 says, It is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, This is the ordinance of the Passover. Now, this is interesting because now there's a restriction given on who may partake of the Passover memorial. And the restriction that God puts on a person is they must be circumcised. In other words, they must have the sign of the covenant of Abraham, which is circumcision, to be able to partake in this memorial of God rescuing His people from Israel. So it says this in verse 43, And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it, but every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. A sojourner and a hired servant shall not eat it. In one house it shall be eaten. You shall not carry any of the flesh outside the house, nor shall you break one of its bones. Now that's an important fact there about the Passover lamb and in the memorial, that no bones of the animal are to be broken. And that ties in something we'll talk about later, the crucifixion, where the bones of Jesus were not broken as the thieves were. And we know He's the true type of the Passover lamb. Verse 47 says, All the congregation of Israel shall keep it, and when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, then let him come near and keep it, and he shall be as a native of the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat it. One law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. Thus all the children of Israel did as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And it came to pass on that very same day that the Lord brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt according to their armies. Now this is very interesting. Here is some information about the importance of the memorial, and also the fact that this is a memorial that is for Israelites and those that are not Israelites but want the blessing of God. They are to be circumcised. They're to take the sign of Abraham, circumcision, and That's the promise. That was the sign of the promise that God had given them the land of Canaan. When they took that exercised their faith in God's promise to them. So God says, this thing that's been done, this is for Israel. And this is about my keeping of the promises and the covenant that I've made to Israel. So if somebody wants to take part in this celebration, in this memorial, they have to also enter into the covenant through circumcision of the flesh. And of course, this is something that would be done to the males to remove part of the flesh from their reproductive organ. So there's a restriction that's placed on who can take part of the Passover. Now then we get into chapter 13. Now what we're going to see is just a repetition of these things where God brings up the importance of the memorial of Passover and remembering this event that God has done. It says this in chapter 13, verse 1, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and beast, it is mine. And Moses said to the people, Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by strength of hand the Lord brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. On this day you are going out, in the month of Beall, that's the first month of the Hebrew calendar. And it shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep this service in this month. Remember the emphasis on the memorial of this. Verse 6, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and no leavened bread shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among you in all your quarters. And you shall tell your son in that day, saying, This is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt. It shall be as a sign to you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. Just as he promised, we might say. Verse 10 says, You shall therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year. So there's a great emphasis on this memorial and the fact that the people are promised that they'll be rescued and then they'll be taken to the land of Canaan, which will be their land. And God will give this land to them. I want to show you, let me take you a little bit further into the book of Exodus. Let me show you that these things are mentioned again here. Exodus 34, it says this in Exodus 34, verse 18. It mentions this again. The feast of unleavened bread, Exodus 34, 18. The feast of unleavened bread you shall keep. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, as I commanded you in the appointed time of the month of Abib. For in the month of Abib you came out from Egypt. So that's mentioned there. And then also in verse 25 of the same chapter, You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven, nor shall the sacrifice of the feast of the Passover be left until the morning. All right? So we see in this section, we see that there's an instruction that God gives Moses and Aaron. This is given also to the people of Israel. They carry it out. This is God's way of protecting and preserving them by the blood of the Lamb. It is also His way of punishing Pharaoh's household and the gods of Egypt by using a sacred image to them, of it being killed and even eating, the Israelites eating this. This would have been an abomination to them, extremely repulsive in every way. And through this, God delivers the nation of Israel. Now we're going to stop there for today, but then we're going to look at the Lord is going to establish this with some additional rules and obligations that will be carried out by them during the Old Testament time. Now, we're going to continue looking at this. We're going to show you some passages in the next teaching about how this was carried out in the Old Testament, and then we'll be looking at how this was carried out in the New Testament, and then we're going to get into why this is so important for New Testament believers. I appreciate you taking time to listen. I hope that it's been a blessing to you. May God bless you and keep you.